The rain hammered against the funeral home windows as I sat in the back row, watching my father's casket disappear behind expensive flowers I couldn't afford. 3 people had shown up. 3. For a man who once owned half the county's most fertile land. My stepmother Margaret sat in front, dabbing her eyes with a silk handkerchief. Her son Derek whispered something in her ear. They looked like they belonged there in their expensive black clothes, while I felt like an imposter in my thrift store suit. The pastor spoke about Dad's generous spirit and loving family, but his words felt hollow. I hadn't spoken to my father in 3 years, not since our last fight about the farm. He'd chosen his new family over his blood, and I'd chosen my pride over reconciliation. After the service, Margaret approached me with Derek trailing behind. Her makeup was perfect, despite her tears. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said, though we both knew it was my loss more than hers. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Part of me had hoped that death might soften whatever wall had grown between Dad and me, that maybe there would be some final acknowledgement of our relationship. "I suppose you'll be wanting to know about the arrangements," Derek added dismissively. I waited, my heart still holding onto a foolish thread of hope. 3 days later, I sat in Patterson and Associates' law office. Margaret and Derek had taken the seats closest to Mr. Patterson's desk. I sat across from them, feeling like a defendant waiting for sentencing. "Thank you all for coming," Patterson began. "I'll be reading the last will and testament of Robert James Mitchell, dated March 15th of this year." My heart jumped. March 15th was my birthday. "To my beloved wife Margaret, I leave the house on Elm Street, along with all furnishings and my savings accounts." Patterson's voice droned through a list of assets I'd never known Dad possessed. "To my stepson Derek, I leave my truck and my gun collection." I shifted in my chair, palms growing damp. This was it. "And to my son Michael, I leave my old toolbox from the garage." The silence was deafening. A toolbox. 27 years of being his son, and I'd inherited a toolbox. Margaret's face showed relief and what might have been pity. Derek simply looked smug. I carried the toolbox to my apartment in a daze, too stunned to feel the full weight of the rejection yet. The toolbox sat in my studio apartment for hours before I could bring myself to open it. It was heavier than expected, made of red metal with scratches that told stories I'd never heard. When I finally lifted the lid, the familiar smell of motor oil brought back memories of Dad teaching me to use these very tools. There were the usual suspects: hammers, screwdrivers, pliers. But at the bottom, wrapped in an oil-stained cloth, was something unexpected: a small digital recorder with my name written on masking tape in Dad's careful handwriting. My hands trembled as I pressed play. "Michael." His voice hit me like a physical blow. "If you're hearing this, then I'm gone, and you probably think I've forgotten about you." I had to pause the recording. Hearing his voice again after 3 years of silence was almost unbearable. "Son, I need you to listen carefully. Things aren't what they seem. Margaret doesn't know about this recording. I've been protecting you, Michael, even when it meant you hated me for it." My head was spinning. Protecting me from what? 5 years ago, when I married Margaret, you thought it was about loneliness, but Margaret was drowning in medical debt. They needed help, and I needed to make sure you were taken care of without them knowing about it. I never actually sold the farm, son. I transferred it to a trust that's been taking care of itself all these years, waiting to come back to you. Margaret thinks I sold it to pay her bills, but the money came from other investments I'd been hiding. I nearly dropped the recorder. The farm was still ours. I had to make Margaret believe I was broke, or she would have expected more. This way, she got what she needed, and you get what's rightfully yours. I know you're confused and probably hate me, but I had to protect you from something worse than a stepmother you didn't like. Dad's voice grew more serious. In the back of this toolbox, there's a false bottom. Inside, you'll find a key to safety deposit box 247 at First National Bank. Mrs. Henderson knows you're coming. The box contains the trust documents, the deed, and a letter explaining everything. I fumbled with the toolbox, found the hidden compartment, and retrieved a small brass key. There are things I needed to say that I couldn't while alive. Margaret's not bad, just scared. But Derek's father, that's a different story entirely. I was protecting you from Vincent Torres, Michael. And if you're not careful, you might need to protect yourself from him too. The recording ended, leaving me with more questions than answers. The next morning, I called in sick and drove to First National Bank. Mrs. Henderson was a small woman in her 60s with kind eyes, who immediately put me at ease. Michael Mitchell, I've been wondering when this day would come. Your father was very specific in his instructions. Inside safety deposit box 247 were several manila envelopes, trust documents, farm deed, financial records, and for Michael. My hands trembled as I opened the personal letter. My dear son, if you're reading this, you know about the farm, but I couldn't say everything in the recording. I was protecting you from Vincent Torres, Derek's biological father, a convicted felon, released 6 months before I married Margaret. The letter explained how Torres had been making threats, demanding money, claiming rights to any assets Margaret might acquire through marriage. By keeping you separate from our family, I kept you safe from Vincent. He never knew about you, the farm, or the real money. As far as he knew, I was just an old farmer who'd fallen for a woman with medical bills. Mrs. Henderson returned with financial documents confirming Dad's claims. The farm wasn't just still ours, it was thriving. Professional management had increased its value from $800,000 to over $1.2 million. Vincent Torres is still around, still looking for ways to get money. If he finds out about your inheritance, the implication was clear. That evening, I stared at the trust documents, trying to figure out my next move. My decision was made when Derek showed up at my apartment door, looking agitated and sweating despite the cool weather. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. I let him in, quickly hiding the documents. "Look, I know we've never gotten along, but we have a problem. My father's back. Vincent Torres." The name from Dad's letter was suddenly real and present. He's been asking questions about Robert's estate. He thinks there's money hidden somewhere. Mum's been hiding from him, but he found her yesterday at the grocery store. He grabbed her arm hard enough to leave bruises. Derek showed me a bank statement he'd found while helping Margaret with finances. It showed regular deposits labeled agricultural consulting fees from something called Green Valley Management. "I think Robert was hiding money from all of us," Derek said. "And I told Vincent about these deposits. I thought if there really is hidden money, maybe I could buy him off." My heart raced. Derek was getting close to the truth, which meant Torres might be too. I made a decision that went against every instinct for self-preservation. "Derek, there's something you need to know about your stepfather." I told him everything. About the recording, the trust, the farm, and Dad's plan to protect all of us from Vincent Torres. Derek's reaction wasn't anger or jealousy, it was relief. So, Robert really was trying to protect us. Mom always said he was a good man, but I thought she was just being naive. Derek walked to my window, looking out at the street. Vincent's been escalating. Yesterday, he didn't just threaten Mom, he hurt her. He said if she doesn't give him $50,000 by Friday, he's going to start hurting people she cares about. "That includes you," I said, "and now it includes you too. If he finds out about the farm, he'll use all of us as leverage." We sat in silence, trying to figure out how to handle a situation Dad had spent 5 years trying to avoid. "What if we give him what he wants?" Derek suggested. "Tell him you inherited the farm, sell it, split the money with him." The suggestion made me sick, but I realized Derek's thinking had merit. even if his execution was flawed. "We're not giving him the farm," I said finally, "but we might be able to convince him there's nothing worth taking." I explained my thinking. Dad's plan had worked because Torres believed there were no significant assets. If we could maintain that illusion while removing the immediate threat to Margaret, we might buy time for a permanent solution. We meet with Torres and offer him a settlement, but not the real money. We use some of the cash Dad left in his regular savings accounts, money Margaret has legitimate claim to as his widow. We would tell Torres that Margaret was willing to give him $30,000 from Robert's estate, but only if he signed an agreement never to contact our family again. We'd make it seem like this was all the money there was. What if he doesn't believe us? Then we show him Margaret's financial records. The house mortgage, medical bills, modest savings accounts. We make him believe Robert Mitchell was exactly what he appeared to be, a simple farmer who used up his assets helping his wife. The plan wasn't foolproof, but it had the advantage of being partially true. Torres would see what he expected, a family struggling with debt and limited resources. "One more thing," I added. "We need Torres to believe I'm not part of any family wealth. As far as he knows, Robert left me nothing but old tools." 3 days later, we met Vincent Torres at a roadside diner. He was exactly what I'd expected, tall, heavily muscled, with cold eyes that catalogued everything as either threat or opportunity. Margaret sat between Derek and me, hands shaking as she gripped her coffee cup. The bruises on her arm were clearly visible despite her makeup. "So you're the son," Torres said when Derek introduced me. "Robert never mentioned having a kid." "Robert and I weren't close," I replied, playing my part. "Especially after he married Margaret. I didn't approve of him spending his money on someone else's medical bills." Torres seemed to accept this. Margaret spoke up, her voice steadier than expected. "Vincent, I've brought what I promised. $30,000 from Robert's savings account. This is everything we can afford." She slid an envelope across the table. Torres counted the bills, his expression unreadable. "This is it? This is all the great Robert Mitchell left behind? The house has a mortgage. The farm was sold years ago for medical expenses. This savings account and Robert's truck are the only assets of value." Torres studied each of our faces. I forced myself to meet his gaze, projecting the resentment I was supposed to feel. "What about you?" he asked me directly. "What did Daddy leave his only son?" I laughed bitterly. "A toolbox full of rusty wrenches." I guess that's what I get for telling him his new wife was going to bankrupt him. Torres took the money, but didn't leave town. For 2 weeks, he stayed at a local motel, occasionally driving past Margaret's house or showing up at Derek's workplace. He was testing our story, looking for signs we had more resources than claimed. During those weeks, I didn't dare go near the farm or contact Mrs. Henderson. I continued working at the hardware store, living in my cramped apartment, playing the bitter son who'd inherited nothing. The breakthrough came when Torres approached Margaret's neighbor, Mrs. Garcia, asking questions about Dad's finances. Mrs. Garcia, who had watched Dad struggle with Margaret's medical bills, confirmed our story. "He sold everything," she told Torres, "even that beautiful farm that had been in his family forever." Poor Margaret felt so guilty, but what else could they do? 3 days after that conversation, Torres left town. Derek called from the motel to tell me he'd watched Vincent load his truck and drive toward the highway. "Do you think he's really gone?" "I think he believes there's nothing left to get. Dad was right about desperate people. Torres needed to believe he'd gotten everything he could, and now he has." We waited another month before I made my first official visit to Green Valley Management. The farm was more beautiful than I remembered, with new fences, updated equipment, and fields that looked healthier than in Dad's prime. Sarah Chen, the manager, had been expecting me for years. "Your father was very clear about his intentions," she said. as we stood on the farmhouse porch. "He wanted this place ready for you when the time came." 6 months later, I was living in the farmhouse where I'd grown up. Margaret and Derek visited occasionally, and we'd developed a genuine friendship based on our shared experience and mutual respect for Dad's complex plan. Margaret used the remaining money from Dad's estate to pay off medical debts. Derek enrolled in community college, studying agricultural management with the idea of helping me run the farm someday. "I keep thinking about how smart Robert was," Margaret said during one visit. "He managed to take care of all of us without any of us understanding what he was doing. Dad had orchestrated an incredibly complex deception that required sacrificing his relationship with me, accepting Derek's resentment, and living with Margaret's guilt. He'd done it all to protect people he loved from a threat they didn't fully understand. The farm was thriving under my management, with Sarah staying on as operations manager. We'd expanded the organic certification program and added a farmer's market component. The land Dad had protected was now supporting several local families. Sometimes I'd sit on the porch with the toolbox beside me, listening to Dad's recording again. His voice reminded me of the lengths people will go to protect their families. I never heard from Vincent Torres again, though occasional internet searches showed he'd moved to Florida and been arrested twice for petty theft. Whatever money he'd taken from us hadn't lasted, but it had convinced him the Mitchell family wasn't worth pursuing. The most surprising development was my relationship with Derek. Away from Torres' influence and Margaret's medical stress, he turned out to be decent, genuinely wanting to learn about farming. He spent weekends at the farm, helping with maintenance and taking on more responsibilities. "I never thanked you," he said one evening as we finished repairing a fence. "For what? For including me in the plan with Vincent. You could have just taken your inheritance and left us to deal with him alone." I thought about that. Dad's recording had been intended for me alone, but sharing the information with Derek had been the right choice. As I write this, it's been 2 years since I inherited the farm. The trust has grown to nearly $1.5 million, and the farm continues to be profitable. More importantly, I've learned to appreciate the wisdom in Dad's approach. He could have simply left me the farm in his will and let consequences fall where they might. Instead, he'd crafted a solution that protected everyone while ensuring our family's legacy would continue. It wasn't perfect. I still wish he'd found a way to let me know what he was doing, but it was effective. Margaret and Derek had become family, whether any of us had planned it or not. Dad's plan had been about protecting family, and he'd succeeded in ways none of us had initially understood. The toolbox sits on my kitchen counter now, holding the same tools Dad used when I was growing up. Sometimes I use them for projects around the farm, and I can almost feel his presence guiding my hands. He may not have been perfect, but he was my father, and he loved me enough to sacrifice our relationship to protect my future. That's a gift worth more than any inheritance. The farm has become more than just my inheritance. It's become a symbol of the complex ways we show love for each other. Dad's carefully orchestrated plan protected not just me, but Margaret and Derek too. He understood that sometimes protecting people means making sacrifices they'll never fully appreciate. Derek now works alongside me full-time, having discovered a genuine passion for sustainable farming. Margaret visits every Sunday, bringing homemade meals and stories about Dad that help me understand the man he was during those final years when we weren't speaking. "He talked about you constantly," she told me recently. "He was so proud of your independence, even when it meant you were independent from him. He knew you'd be able to handle the farm when the time came." The recording device sits in the toolbox, a reminder that love sometimes requires secrecy, sacrifice, and faith that the people we're protecting will eventually understand our motives. Dad gambled that I'd be mature enough to see past my hurt feelings and recognize what he'd really been doing. He was right. The land that's been in my family for 3 generations will continue for at least one more. And maybe if Derek decides to stay and eventually have children of his own, it will continue even longer. Dad would have liked that, his careful plan ensuring not just my future, but the future of the family he'd worked so hard to protect. That toolbox full of rusty wrenches turned out to be the most valuable inheritance I could have received, not because of what it contained, but because of what it represented. A father's love expressed in the most complex and protective way imaginable. Thank you so much for listening to this story about family, sacrifice, and the complex ways we show love for each other. I hope it resonated with you and reminded you that sometimes the people we think have forgotten us are actually working behind the scenes to protect us. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Please let me know what part of the world you're listening from, and if this story reminded you of any experiences with family secrets or unexpected inheritances in your own life. And if you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to the channel for more tales about family, secrets, and the surprising ways life unfolds. Your support helps me continue sharing these stories, and I'm grateful for each and every one of you who takes the time to listen. Until next time, take care of each other out there.